Welcome to the sixth Kasten Cube series webinar. I love how the series is going. I'm Tom Leyden. I'm VP of Marketing here at Kasten by Veeam, and I'm going to be your host today. Fortunately, we have someone a lot smarter than me, Joey. Joey Lee is Principal Product Manager here at Kasten by Veeam, and he will be sharing some great content on Kubernetes Security Everywhere with Kasten K10. I've seen the preparations, and this is going to be an amazing webinar. So as more companies are migrating to Kubernetes, it's really essential to have the right tools in place to maintain security. So not just backing up your data, which is something we're really good at, but you want all-encompassing security, which we refer to as security everywhere. And Kasten K10 provides reliable, secure, one-click backup recovery and data protection for Kubernetes applications. And Joey will be digging into that. He will cover topics such as how to implement security everywhere from development to deployment. He will be discussing best practices on applying shift left to data protection and cover ecosystem advancements ranging from procurement to operations. Before I hand it over to Joey for the good stuff, let's go through a few practicalities. Everyone except Joey and myself will be muted, but we still want this webinar to be super interactive. So when you have questions, please go to the Q&A box and put your questions in there. If I find a moment to interrupt Joey, we will respond to the questions live. I'm not going to do that for all questions because we usually get a lot of great questions here. So what's going to happen is we have a team that will be answering the questions directly in the chat box. And then at the end of the webinar, I will do, let's say, a best of for Joey so he can go a little bit more in detail for the best questions that we have received. Also, there will be a couple of polling questions during the webinar. Those are meant to help us tailor the content of these webinars to your needs. So it would be great if you could take the time to answer these polling questions. And then finally, to thank you for the time that you're putting into attending this webinars. Everybody will get the recording and the slides. And one lucky attendee will be receiving a $200 gift card. I believe that's an Amazon gift card. We will be doing a live raffle at the end of the webinar for that. So please, if you want to make a chance to winning that $200 Amazon gift card, you should be staying until the end of the webinar when we select a random winner. As I mentioned, the recording of the webinar and the slides will be made available afterwards. So keep an eye on that inbox for those links. All right, so without further ado, Joey, you want to take it from here?
Thank you, Tom, and good to see everyone from around the world. Glad to be here. We're going to talk to you about security everywhere in Kasten K10. I want to share a little bit about my background. So I worked in data protection for well over a decade. I spent 12 years in the product and engineering team at Dell EMC. I spent the last couple of years in the field in a managed services practice where I led the portfolio of a variety of services, including managed security services. And one interesting thing about having fit into a product and a field type of role is you definitely get to see the types of incidents and real world situations that come up. And it's really helped informed our product strategy when it comes to the security everywhere solution that we want to talk to you about. So let's just dig right in. So at Kasten, if you're not familiar with Kasten, I want to share with you a little bit about our objective and our mission. And our key objective is to really help you run your applications on Kubernetes with confidence. And confidence is really an important sticking point here. Kubernetes is new for a lot of us, and potentially we're on a very multi-year emerging journey to get to cloud-native containerized applications on a new platform. And one of the biggest inhibitors to forward momentum is often the concern with security, of course, and data security. So we have the data management capabilities to really help you get to market quicker with features like application mobility. And we also have the data protection capabilities to help bring that confidence and protect those investments you've made so hard to develop your applications and put them into a cloud native platform like Kubernetes. Now, one thing about the ecosystem, you can say that your peers are also confident. It's a rapidly growing ecosystem. Some research by well-known analysts by IDC, Gartner, ESG, they've started to estimate that 50% of enterprises are going to need backup solutions as we move forward into this new paradigm. And by 2024, it's very likely that we're going to have over 500 million new applications, with a majority of those running in some kind of containerized architecture. We know from the CNCF reports that Kubernetes is definitely taking the charge, and more enterprises are deploying into production for their workloads. And that's huge growth, right? Huge growth, but at the same time, a lot of risk and a huge amount of revenue to protect. So what are the key requirements for a data protection solution for Kubernetes specifically? Because that's where Kasten focuses. Here's what our customers told us and how we've shaped our product. First attribute is really being Kubernetes native. And to be Kubernetes native essentially means you speak the language. And literally, you speak the language of a Kubernetes API and other applications in the ecosystem. By speaking the Kubernetes API and having a native Kubernetes API, that's going to allow a very deep and rich integration with a variety of other open source platforms to extend your infrastructure, to extend your cloud native application experience. And we feel that this is essential for building the most automated experience as well as the most turnkey experience into delivering these applications to your end users. The second aspect across data protection is really something we call multi-layered consistency. Now, if you come from data protection from the virtual world, or even in the physical world, in the last decade of IT, you've probably heard app consistent or crash consistent. Well, our solution is all of the above. Our backups are not only infrastructure backups, but they're also application backups. And we take advantage of the native Kubernetes abstractions to package it very simply in more of a business point of view. This is your key application for your front end. This is your key application for supporting the databases. By taking an application-centric approach, which we'll talk about, you can more easily compartmentalize the IT, but still get all those benefits of a full consistent backup. The third attribute is around freedom of choice. And this is something very strongly that resonates not only with Kasten, but our entire company at Veeam. Software agnostic and cloud agnostic is very important to us because we know that the ecosystem we're working with is rapidly evolving. There's no room in our strategy to be locked to one vendor or one platform. And so being cloud agnostic is essentially our strategic advantage. We can partner with anyone of your choosing. And it's very likely that for any Kubernetes distribution, any storage partner, any cloud provider, it's very likely it's going to be supported on Kasten K10. The fourth key attribute is something we call DevOps speed and scale. And this has largely to do with being cloud native. We're working with new operational models. We've got a new integrated team with developers and platform teams alike. There's a new set of expectations and responsibilities when we're moving through a DevOps cycle. And so we've built our product for the operations team and for the developers. There's a very consumer grade UI, as well as a very intelligent, smart API that sits alongside it, where you can operate either or and still get the same seamless experience for managing data protection. And we've been fortunate to say that our analysts, our colleagues at GigaOM have recognized our leadership. And we've been fortunate to say for the second year in a row, GigaOM has actually recognized Kasten by Veeam as a data protection leader in the Kubernetes data protection report. And if you're not used to the dimensions of this report compared to, say, like a Magic Quadrant, this report measures on 4 dimensions: your feature breadth, your platform capabilities, your maturity in the enterprise model, and your ability to innovate. And as you get closer to the center of this diagram, you start to meet more of those 4 key dimensions, and the more compelling your product is considered on those 4 dimensions. If you want to check out a free copy of that report, you can quickly scan that QR code, and you can read it on your own time, of course. So let's get into one of our key differentiators. The first thing I want to talk about is something called application centricity. And this is really something that Kubernetes has actually shown us from the get-go, and why many enterprises choose to run applications on Kubernetes is because of the abstractions that Kubernetes affords for making application development more seamless. It abstracts the infrastructure away very well. And this approach for data protection that we've adopted is exactly the same. By enabling a focus on the business application, you're going to be able to prioritize what your general managers want, what your product owners want, which is essentially to grow adoption, grow revenue, but at the same time, protect critical revenue streams that are attached to certain business processes. So you might have a front-end UI where that serves as a payment portal, or you might have a critical back-end service that's actually storing the data, for collecting and interacting with your product. Less time, this approach allows you more time to meet the business stakeholder needs and less requirement to figure out the mechanics of how to back up this storage array or how to back up this, application. It's more about the application itself.
Joey, I have a good question. Saurabh is asking us how Kasten K10 plays a role in terms of security for public cloud vendors. So I would assume that's when you're deploying Kubernetes in the cloud. Can you address that for a second?
Yeah, so Kasten because it's a cloud agnostic product. For example, the first thing we do is we harden our backups when using it in a public cloud scenario. So we always encrypt our backups in flight, at rest, and that's very important when we're delegating storage to a third-party service provider or cloud provider. That's one aspect of the platform we're always going to offer. In addition, we integrate natively with the storage drivers. So we integrate with the container storage interface, which many of the cloud providers also provide. And that allows us an abstraction to actually safely move your data from within cloud to cloud.
Great. All right, please continue.
Okay. So that was just a little bit of intro just on Kasten. And now we're actually going to get into the meat of the conversation, which is talking about our Security Everywhere strategy. And one thing and because this is a security conversation, we're going to want to talk about risk management. And this is about the mitigation, the avoidance, the prevention of risks that could potentially impact progress. Our data management solution extends your risk management strategy. And historically, data protection solutions have been focused only on one aspect of what's known as a CIA triad, which is the availability of your data. And as we're starting to see what our customers are challenged with, what are the situations they're put up against, it's clear that the data security needs are growing. And so there's a need for our solutions to now address things like confidentiality, which have historically have been a challenge addressed by core security platforms, right? So network security, endpoint security. Data is ultimately the end target for a lot of adversaries. And so it's very important that we're not just securing the perimeter, but we're providing a holistic defense in depth solution, which includes extra protections on the data itself, because ultimately that's the end goal for most adversaries. So confidentiality is very important to us because it helps ensure your customers are continuing to trust you with their data. And secondly, the integrity is very important to ensure that when we do interact with our customers and do store their data or manipulate their data or transform their data, that they're not going to have an unexpected experience, right? Can you imagine if you went to your ATM and your bank account didn't have the right numbers and some adversary manipulated that data to trick you that you felt like your money was missing, right? That kind of situation for our end users is very concerning, and it impacts our ability to build a brand, to build trust. In addition to providing your core services, right? Like for a bank institution to service availability of money to customers, all these three attributes are very important. And so the key focus here when we talk about risk management is to help mitigate business impacts, whether it's revenue, whether it's brand, whether it's the exploitation of your customers' data. And Kasten has come a long way in building out our Security Everywhere strategy. It's really started for us since the 3.0 release of K10. And if you're a customer of K10, you know that we release new product every 2 weeks. We have a new version of our product that's available every 2 weeks. And roughly every 6 months or so, we have a new version highlighting the major platform capabilities. So in 3.0, we introduced our multi-tenancy, our isolation capabilities, our multi-cloud, our multi-cluster solution. In 4.0, we launched the first ransomware protection solution with immutability for S3 providers. And in the current release in 5.0, we've extended this platform to cover the entire lifecycle of DevOps, everything from the development stage, all the way up to staging and deployment. Hence the phrase security everywhere. And what does that look like? So for us, security everywhere, we segment it into each logical stage of a development lifecycle. First, your developers are building the app, and there are data protection considerations that can and should be taken on in this early stage. Historically, data protection is a day two operation. Someone ships to the platform team, or the development team ships to staging, ships to production, and then we ask our operations team to go ahead and back up those applications. Now that's a fine model. It's worked for decades, of course, in past generation IT models. But now what we're coming into is that we've increased our velocity so much that a simple human error in a bug in code can cause vulnerabilities to be deployed at scale. And this is particularly true if you're using infrastructure as code. A very simple, honest code mistake in the infrastructure as code can have wide-ranging consequences. And that's why you've likely seen, if you've looked at other security presentations, you've likely seen that there's a shift left in the process, right? Where we need to consider all security and data protection topics upfront, because that states the business requirement, at the same time guarantees or increases confidence that you're going to have secure infrastructure from the get-go. So we're going to talk about a few things in the dev side. We're also going to talk about the during deployment staging, what should you be considering, and of course in runtime, as you guys are as your infrastructure is being put up into production, what can you do to harden your platform?
All right, Joey, I have another great question. Morten is asking about on-prem immutable storage for ransomware protection. Yep. He has a client, he has a client where cloud storage is not allowed.
Yeah, let's talk about the term cloud storage. I think a lot of us, when we hear that, we automatically assume it's in the public cloud space. But cloud, I like to call cloud, it's not a place, it's an operating model. So you can deploy a private cloud solution, and it would typically have properties that are similar to public cloud: elasticity, the ability to scale out. There are a lot of vendors in our partner list that we can recommend that offer a private cloud solution that you can have a scale out object store to store our backups. Kasten does support NFS, so that's always going to be an option for you if you have more of a traditional storage array. But we have partners who we do go to market with for private cloud that can be deployed in a data center.
Thank you, Joey.
Okay, any other question? Okay, let's continue. So we're going to talk about each of these 4 or 5 different things in depth. This is just an at-a-glance view. Essentially, the takeaway here is that the K10 platform does offer solutions from development to the deployment stage. The first topic I want to talk about is something that is something we've been working with for a long time. But if you're new to Kubernetes, you know that this experience can be very challenging. And this is role-based access control. Now, a lot of Kubernetes solutions are configured through command line. There are multi-cluster management solutions that have simplified for you. But given that Kasten is a Kubernetes native product, we also extend the Kubernetes API in a variety of ways, which for a third-party platform may not come out of the box. So we've taken it to our responsibility to really provide that simplicity in the management experience, for example, for role-based access control. And why is this important for data management? Well, now that we're talking about storing all the data and centralizing governance in one place, it is really important to actually think about your access policies. So there's an attack that's called living off the land. And this is an attack where an adversary uses legitimate software to perform malicious acts. And the danger in a living off the land type of attack is that usually the detection software is not looking after trusted software. So K10, for example, would be an example of a trusted software. But we also know that phishing, credential compromise, SMS phishing is becoming more common. And we we need to harden our access and authentication so that we're using something called least privileged access, where we're only assigning authorization for deletion, for restoration of data for the roles that need it to perform their daily functions, and minimizing the amount of access rights in wherever possible, right? So for example, a privileged admin should probably be the only type of admin who can delete data. You might even make the choice that that privileged admin is the only one who can do recovery of data, because that would also mean that we are limiting the exposure to a credential compromise where someone might use the backup product to exfiltrate data. So that largely depends on the risk tolerance and, of course, the type of data. More confidential, more sensitive type of data is typically a larger target for exfiltration. So if you manage financial data, you manage healthcare data, you have patents, intellectual property, those are typically targets for data exfiltration, and you might want to consider a more restrictive access policy, even if it does come at the cost of a little bit of productivity, right? It's a balance between productivity and security in this case. But so RBAC is really just a starting point. When we're talking about development, RBAC is really just giving and granting access to different APIs. But there comes a situation where you might actually need to enforce and restrict behaviors. And this comes more commonly when we're talking about the data protection objectives. So the RPO, the retention, the immutability status of those backups. What RBAC doesn't prevent, it does not prevent something called cloud misconfigurations. And misconfigurations are actually in a cloud native environment, they're the most common type of vulnerability. And these are caused by human error, most typically, not a bug in software, not a vulnerability in a package. It's typically caused by human error, and it's very common. And so misconfiguration in the traditional sense would be you're launching containers as root. You have a network policy that exposes traffic that is really just not needed for the application. That increases the risk for lateral movement. Or you have storage that you forgot to encrypt, or backups you forgot to enable immutability for. Those are not necessarily code vulnerabilities, right? But they are configuration vulnerabilities. And the security industry has risen to the occasion to create more supply chain security solutions, and one called policy as code. We call this feature the data protection policy guardrails, and we leverage policy as code, which aims to solve the problem of cloud misconfiguration, targeting infrastructure as code that we're writing to deploy our production infrastructure and to deploy our data protection infrastructure. In the data protection context, this essentially is double checking your RPO, it's double checking your retention. Retention can go both ways. If it's too short, it might not meet compliance for HIPAA or PCI. If it's too long, you're actually exposing risk to exfiltration because you're storing data longer than it's actually needed. So we've set these policies, within our operations team. But with policy as code, you can codify those compliance restrictions, and you can actually enforce behavior so that in case we make an accidental mistake, that we're doing the right thing. What we found in research, and this is a study from the Prisma Cloud team at Bridgecrew, the Palo Alto Networks team, 80% of a popular infrastructure as code repo, most of the provisioning is not including backups as part of that. So if you just downloaded one of the community modules to deploy, a Postgres database, 80% of the time, there's not a backup configuration that comes with it, and you have to figure that out. But that's a standard we should strive to change. We should have data protection as part of the core provisioning model, just like we would harden network security, just like we would harden the access rights. Right? It should just be very commonplace. And we're here to show you how you can do that. So there are two main ways to enable the data protection guardrails. The first is for a DevOps-enabled organization. Some of the DevOps organizations that we've talked to are using an operating model called GitOps. And GitOps is how it works is we code our infrastructure as code, and you can use a variety of programming frameworks. Here we've just done traditional Kubernetes YAML, and you check it into a Git repo. That code is peer reviewed. It's checked by the security policy as code for compliance, and it can be integrated directly into our CI/CD pipeline. So Jenkins, the Argo project, or Flux. In the example on the right, we have some Kasten policies and Kasten profiles checked into a Git repo. And the policy as code here, it's going to look at these specific objectives. It's going to look for 321. It's going to look for a 7-year retention. It's going to look for an hourly RPO because this is mission critical. But we found in our profile, and this normally this would be omitted, but we've shown it as a commented line in this case to show you the bug in the configuration. But it turns out we forgot to enable immutability for that location profile, which is going to leave the backups, unfortunately, exposed to deletion and corruption attacks, which are common in the ransomware attack pattern. The GitOps workflow works like this. So let's say your development team wants to create a new tier 0 mission critical policy for their apps. They write some prod code, stateful sets, PVCs to be provisioned, and then they also write the data protection policy, the K10 profile and policies. They commit this code to, let's say, a new branch, a test branch, and they initiate a pull request in GitHub where they invite the cloud team, the data protection team, for feedback. Is this correct? In parallel, the policy as code engine, so in this case, this is Open Policy Agent, it's going to review your code, and it's going to either automatically approve or deny that pull request. Once you figure out, what's the right code to sign off on compliance, and you've gotten the right feedback from other, engineers in your team, then we can merge it into the main branch. And what GitOps is going to do from then on, it's going to recognize that there's drift in the main sort of source of truth. And GitOps essentially pulls code from the infrastructure as code repo, and it will deploy to what's known as the desired state, right? Because Kubernetes YAML is basically a declarative infrastructure as code language. So it's always going to try and meet that desired state once you've committed it into a main branch. Let's see how this actually works in a demo. So here we have an example of a Kubernetes policy engine called Kyverno. Kyverno and Open Policy Agent, they're both Kubernetes native. So they both support our applications. This one is implementing a policy called 321. When 321 states that you need 3 copies of your data, 2 on different storage targets, and 1 of those copies being on some kind of offsite or cloud location. And you can see here that this code is looking at K10 policies, and it has an enforcement condition called a deny, where if the Kasten policy object doesn't have the backup action followed by the export action, it's actually going to deny provisioning of that resource. And this is how exactly it would prevent misconfiguration, that it would inspect the code and not allow that resource to be created. But the developer is going to get some instantaneous feedback. If we're setting it up as part of a CI/CD process, we need another file called the Kyverno unit test, which essentially you have to point it, what's the policy, what's the policy as code, what's the resource you're trying to validate, and what's the expected result. This is how you would set up, say, a unit test for application developers. Lastly, we can inspect the Kasten code. In here, this is a policy object. It's got my retention. It's got my RPO. It looks correct. But we've noticed actually in the actions, for some reason, the export action is commented out. Maybe I was testing a staging cloud object store and I wasn't ready to actually perform that export. And we just, by human nature, we forgot to uncomment that code before we checked it in. That would technically violate 321 because we're not copying it to an offsite location. How you set up this test is you go into GitHub Actions, which is a more simplistic, CI/CD process, and you can set up the test to say on any push of new code, any pull request of new code, we're going to automatically run the Kyverno framework. We're going to check out the policies. We're going to check out the source code that you're trying to commit, and we're going to download one of the GitHub Marketplace modules for running the Kyverno test and validate engine. And then, of course, we're going to run that CLI to validate that policy in action. I've actually accelerated here. I've simulated a PR test failure here to show you exactly what that looks like. So it's running the Kyverno validate as part of a commit of your new code. And what it's doing here is actually setting up a fully isolated runtime environment where it's checking out the policies from GitHub. It's setting up the kernel, executables, the binaries that it needs to run the test. And then it goes ahead and actually runs the test that you wanted to verify and hold up against compliance. Here we can see that the policy that I just checked in with export commented out, it actually failed. And that gives the developer instant feedback to say that there's something wrong with the backup policy you just committed. Go back and check, get some feedback from your colleagues to see what the problem could be. Depending on the CI/CD framework you're using, you can customize this output and give it maybe a more instant feedback response. But again, you can use this logic with any CI/CD platform that supports command line interface. It's very useful for ensuring the right behaviors, especially if you're using infrastructure as code at scale. Now, if you're not using GitOps, that's okay, because in our surveys, we've found that maybe 10 or 20% of organizations are, sorry, my presentation started to freeze up. Let me just pause video because I know this tends to happen. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we're good. We're good, Joey.
Okay. My PowerPoint's spinning right now, so it's not progressing to the main slide. So I'll start chatting just a little bit here. If you're not ready with GitOps, we found that, okay, there you go. We found that 10% of organizations are typically not running GitOps, are running GitOps, and the other 80 to 90% are running more of a traditional model. And that's okay, because the policy as code will continue to find value in that scenario as well. So let's say you have a dedicated data protection team, you have a cloud platform team that's responsible for the profiles and the policies and deploying those manually. The policy as code is not just for a CI/CD platform. It's actually originally designed for Kubernetes natively, something called the admission controller. And you can think of the admission controller as sort of the watchdog. Your RBAC policy is going to check that that API can be run by that admin, whether it's privileged or non-privileged. And then once RBAC has successfully passed, it passes itself to the admission controller. And the admission controller is double checking that API against your policy as code. So if I didn't have my 321, if I didn't assign a label that says use the gold data protection policy, the admission controller is going to catch that, and it's going to deny deployment of your application in that case. You can keep it as strict or as informal as possible. You can have an audit function where you can just be aware of the behaviors, but not enforce, because that enforcement essentially restricts forward momentum. You can customize whether you want to audit or if you want to strictly enforce. It's totally up to you, and the engines support you in doing that. But my recommendation is that you do strictly enforce certain things like immutability, because as we get more mature, there's more data we're storing with our customers, that increases the target, increases ourselves as a target against an adversary. And so immutability is one of those properties I would recommend enforcing. And so immutability doesn't have to be strictly through code. The thing about the Kasten UI is that we've also designed it to have a consumer grade UI experience. And so configuring immutability through Kasten is a piece of cake. We guide you through the workflow of setting up an object locked S3 bucket, which is a prerequisite for creating immutable backups. And we can do this as part of setting up a location profile. So earlier we had the question of, do we have to use the public cloud providers? Do we have to use AWS, Azure, or GCP? There are actually more private cloud S3 providers who support object lock than there are public clouds in our support matrix. And so you'll find that there are a variety of choices you can make, whether private or public, for object locked and S3 object storage. Now, moving forward, we should be very comfortable that we can recover our data with ease and with data integrity with immutable backups. But for those of you who have experience with ransomware, and unfortunately for those of us who have had the experience and pleasure of working with those adversaries, we know that there are multiple types of attacks going on other than sort of affecting your availability. We know that there are emerging concerns with data exfiltration, and an immutability solution cannot necessarily help you with that situation. So threat researchers at a cybersecurity firm called Checkpoint, they started to do some great research in analyzing the cost of ransomware, something we call the collateral cost of ransomware. And what we found in this study is that the adversaries, they're doing something, they're doing a strategic calculation to determine what's the appropriate ransom payment to target a company with. And that flipping it on its head, essentially they're trying to determine their viability for revenue. And it's weird to talk about ransom as revenue, but in that world, it is revenue. And they're entirely motivated by revenue and not by some political or other goal. It's typically revenue. And so what the study has found is that the ransom payments are typically a small percentage of your estimated revenue, and plus the percentage of collateral damage they can inflict upon your business, which is historically for payouts between 1% to 5% of total revenue. If they're doing more damage than that, it's more likely that all of us are going to say, no, we're not paying the ransom. We can't afford this loss. And so it's strategically sized in that respect. And the reason that's important is because we can still apply protections, preventions, detections to get us under that threshold. And so one thing to know about these collateral damages, just to be aware of what they are, you have your classic unavailability situation, that's ransomware. It impacts revenue, it impacts our ability to service customers. We also have the opportunity cost of your resources having to be redirected on response, as well as disaster recovery. So that's where a turnkey DR solution like Kasten comes in, where it's very simple, it's very automated. It minimizes the opportunity cost of your staff having to rotate and work on an incident, whereas those resources could be working, of course, on new deployments, new provisioning, servicing new users. It's really important to have that turnkey experience. Third part of it is going to be the extortion of your customers' data, your end user customers, which causes brand damage. It causes reputation loss, and ultimately a loss of trust and sometimes churn of our customers. What this amounts to is that sometimes the ransom payment does feel like the lower cost advantage, but I don't want you to think like that. I want you to think that the software solutions are really needing to rise to the challenge to get that cost of incident lower than anything else. And so we need to do better, right? And how do we do that? Having a robust recovery strategy is absolute. It's going to be the data protection is the solution of last resort in an incident. But we're also going to be investing in more capabilities that could be pre-incident. And what do I mean by that? The key to really minimizing damage is to recognize the signs of these collateral attacks, and to detect the early warning signs before the major damage occurs, right? Before the encryption of all the data occurs. So let's talk about ransomware attack detection and what is the pattern for detection of this. Essentially, this is where you're going to need to consider a defense in depth strategy, Kasten and other solutions. Defense in depth really relies on the fact that we can't stop somebody, but we can slow them down. And if we implement a variety of guardrails and a variety of protections and a variety of gates, access controls, and other things, we're going to get more time to detect that attack in progress. And hopefully when we detect that attack, we're going to be able to respond in a manner that will prevent the majority of the damage, right, before the major encryption happens, right? So in the pattern, there's a variety of things going on. There's evasive, stealthy attacks that are very hard to detect. There's lateral movement. But as you start to see actions on data, it becomes more clear what's happening. So who's looking at data? That's called data discovery. Who's trying to package data in preparation for exfiltration? And of course, the act of moving data across the network to another untrusted storage location. That's exfiltration. But we also see destruction of data before encryption. We see the destruction of backups before encryption happens. There are a variety of warning signs we can try to detect before that. So for Kasten, because our visibility is on the data, we've decided to make investments in a defense in-depth solution to help give you visibility surrounding the crown jewels. In this case, the application data that's stored in the backup infrastructure. So two key attacks that we can detect in the Kasten K10 solution. The first is the destruction of backup data where it lives by inspecting the object buckets. And in this case, specifically, S3 buckets that support the immutability feature. You can see a couple of those vendors. Some of these are private cloud vendors. Some of these are public cloud vendors. We support all of these for detecting attacks on the immutable infrastructure. And without kind of going into detail and kind of sharing how it works, because that would be exposing the secret, we essentially detect integrity attacks. So if somebody's trying to compromise the integrity of that object store, we're going to know about it because it's not operated by Kasten, and only Kasten should be touching that bucket, at that point. So we're aware of integrity attacks. The second part is detection of the data discovery and data exfiltration of backup data. Because Kasten is Kubernetes native, we're extending the Kubernetes API with native constructs, which allows the Kasten actions to be fully auditable in the Kubernetes audit log. That audit log is not enabled by default, but if you do enable it, we can customize it to track Kasten API calls. And this can be used in conjunction with container runtime projects, which integrate with the Kubernetes audit log to start to seed the data and event logs that could potentially be malicious. And usually we'll want to pair it with a correlation engine, some kind of machine learning process. While there's no correlation or AI in Kasten itself, there are a variety of security platforms that do this. So there's SIM providers, there's EDR, XDR solutions. Some of them accept third-party data. If you have one of those solutions in your platform, you can send K10 events to that, and it will correlate those events alongside events on your network, events on your containers. We have a demo actually of this working in a project that you might know called the Falco project by the Sysdig team. So let's check it out. So here we have a set of dialogues. Pretend I'm the adversary in this scenario. We've got our Kasten interface on the upper right. So say I've compromised maybe a credential of an admin. On the bottom right, if I've compromised access to the node, it's through maybe a privilege escalation. And on the left-hand side here, we have something called the Falco sidekick. It's really a debugging utility just to test that your detections are working. In production, you would want to have logs sent to a SIM, most likely, but in this case, for visual purposes, we're using the sidekick. So in this case, let's say me as an adversary, I've compromised the K10 root user, super user. Hopefully that never happens, but it can happen. It's got unrestricted permissions and access to K10. If I were an adversary, the first thing I would do is I would look through my application catalog, right? What apps are actually being deployed into production? What's their backup status? Are there any vulnerabilities in that backup status? Some, some high RPOs that maybe I could disrupt. In this case, I found a web app, Nginx server. That could be a front-end interface. That could be something that services customers. I'm going to check out those restore points just to see what exactly I'm working with. And you can see here that Falco has actually detected that API call because, again, the UI interface is just another interface for the Kasten API. And you can start to inspect what exactly is going on, which users are trying to inspect and discover data, what resources are they targeting. So, they might be targeting your confidential namespaces. And there's more detail than you probably would want in a single interface, but just for the sake of this demo, you're going to want a SIM to correlate this with other events that's happening in your network. So let's say as the adversary, I'm happy with what I see. This is something I want to target and encrypt in the future. Really one of the attacks that happens alongside and probably before a ransomware actually happens is to try to delete those backups. Because in this case, I'm trying to compromise the company's source of redundancy. In the case of immutability, you'd be protected, right? You can't delete those backups. They're immutable by nature. But in this attack, let's say it's not immutable, and we go ahead and delete that restore point. We want to know about it, regardless if it's immutable or not, right? So we've tuned the rules in Falco, for example, here to detect the deletion of those backups. So you can see here, there's a new discovery action. My get command was a new discovery action. That deletion triggered another alert where it's showing that a restore point was deleted by the Minikube user. It's targeting the Nginx namespace, right? And that happens to be one of my critical apps, hosting one of my critical apps. And that's a risk for, hey, sound the alarm bells, alert the authorities. There might be a ransomware attack imminent. Now, hopefully, it's very likely you'll need automation to trigger a response that quickly, because sometimes the deletion attacks come in parallel as an encryption attack. So, it's your choice though to invest in security automation, right? And SOAR platforms are very commonly implemented with SIMs to provide that automatic response, perhaps to isolate the app in that case. So now moving forward, we're in runtime, we're running in production, say we're happily running for months, for years, and we know that detection is just one part of a defense in depth strategy. It's ultimately very important that incidents can still occur, to understand that incidents can still occur, and that we understand that the data protection solution is the defense of last resort. In this case, we want to make sure that we have a recovery platform that's ultimately hardened against all of these attacks. And we talked about in the beginning how we harden against a cloud platform. The first hardening that we implemented when we first created our product was to encrypt all data, right? K10 has always provided the option to encrypt all data, all backups, all the metadata. And this can actually be taken a step further if you need to control those encryption keys. This is useful for when you are delegating storage to that third-party cloud provider to have ownership of the encryption data, encryption keys, so that you have the governance to access, control, and manage permissions on data. So we support HashiCorp Vault, which is a very common solution in the Kubernetes world. We also support AWS KMS for this. And you can use this to rotate, to create, to delete, manage encryption keys, and you can control the level of access to your backups through those solutions. Some of you might have heard of us coming from a Veeam installation. So we welcome you if you're a Veeam customer. For the VBR customers, we've also built integrations with the VBR repositories. So you can send Kasten K10 backups to a Veeam repository. In the case of immutability, we support the Linux-based hardened repositories for Veeam, and this is going to allow a immutable Veeam target in this case. So with Kasten, you can rest assured that you can leverage your existing investments that you've made with the VBR platform. Now, we talked about a lot, and I just want to kind of send home one piece of advice. You have a lot of choice. You have a lot of choice with what you go with in terms of your platform. And I heartily recommend considering a defense in-depth strategy, choosing partners who've partnered with security platforms to create those capabilities. So you can be rest assured that we have one of the widest ecosystems to help you enable that choice. A variety of data services that we protect, a variety of Kubernetes distributions that we work with, a variety of storage partners that you can choose for your object lock, for your immutability. And now we're starting to increase our investment with security services. We hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you want to give Kasten K10 a try, it's free to start. You can go to kasten.io/try Kasten K10 or just scan that QR code. And then I believe, Tom, we might have some more questions that we might be able to answer.
Absolutely. I got a bunch, just need to be careful that I'm not repeating the ones we already did live, so correct me there if I'm making a mistake. I think it was again Morton who was asking whether backups are actually protected against ransomware and how we do that.
Yeah, so that comes back to the immutability property. So let me just explain how that exactly works. The object store has a property for S3 specifically. S3 has led the charge on this. It has a property called object lock. And what object lock does is essentially it forces the retention of that object for a certain period of time. So we store our backups as segmented objects. We perform deduplication, and those segments are stored as objects. So there's actually two layers of defense to our strategy, right? We're essentially sharding our backups into fragments, right? And an attacker would theoretically need to know the logic of how to piece that back together into a full, consistent application backup. But on top of that, those objects can't be deleted or modified, and that preserves the integrity of those application backups.
All right, awesome, thank you. Then there was someone with no name who still had an interesting question. That person is using K3s on limited resources devices. And the person wanted to know whether we support K3s, whether Kasten K10 is light.
We support we support a variety of distributions, even if you didn't see it on the screen. In fact, a number of our free trial users are using K3s. K3s and Rancher, for example, are the most popular open source distributions in our install base. So the one caveat, though, is if you're doing this on your Mac and you've got an M1 ARM chip architecture, we currently don't support the ARM architecture. And so if you're using K3s on your Mac, that won't be a supported configuration. But if you're running it on an Intel chipset, that is a supported configuration.
And with that, you actually answered two questions at the same time, because there was a question on ARM support. So very visionary. Then there was a question from Federico. Pay attention, Joey, it's a long one.
Okay.
Federico explained that they're using Kubernetes on the edge, and almost all tools and enabler products are geared to Kubernetes in the cloud. So the question then is whether there's anything special that K10 provides for edge-hosted Kubernetes applications with unreliable or little to no internet connectivity.
Oh, that's a great point. So there's several points I want to make about edge configurations. We have edge customers today, and the majority of the production installations are actually air-gapped. So K10 is designed to operate in an air-gapped mode. What you do with the installation is you download from our Helm chart, which normally requires an online installation. You download the container images from our Helm repo. You put that into your localized repo for distribution, and then you can install the Kasten product without internet. Backups, of course, need to be to a local target, right? NFS, a private cloud object store would be a common choice there. And to help you manage the edges at scale, what we didn't show you in this particular demo was we have a multi-cluster manager, which over time, we're going to actually make that the main interface as a default. So default today is a single cluster interface, but we have an optional multi-cluster interface. And that's going to help you create to actually push global data protection policies at scale. You'll have to open up, ports and other things to actually distribute those policies. But we fully support the edge model, and that's actually one of the strengths of kind of our turnkey experience.
All right, great, thank you. Folks, we have 5 minutes with some time for one extra question, I think. But while we wait for any potential additional questions, Aditya was asking how we support disaster management, how that is managed.
Well, in our policies, we have several actions. We have a backup action, we have an export to cloud action, and then we have something called an import. And import essentially is the reverse of an export. If we're pushing a fully packaged application to an object store, you can also read from that object store and pull that application to another cluster. So typically how our customers set up DR is to set up that flow. From one cluster, you're backing up, you're exporting, and then from the other cluster, you're importing from that same object store. So you're going to need to have your choice of your shared region. You could do a distributed strategy by backing up locally, replicating that object to another region, and then having the cluster on that other region locally accessible to import from that. And that would give you really the fastest RTO in that situation. But in short, it's configured through our API and through our policies.
All right. A good live question from Kostap. The protection and action is predictive or active when any malicious happens. What is the automation integration available? And if you need to read that, that's still in the Q&A on the open questions.
One thing about the about AI machine learning prediction is it's more accurate when you have more data. And so the thing about Kasten is that we have visibility to the data, which is very important, but it's not a full picture. To be very transparent, full picture includes endpoint, network, identity, and data. So to have I would say to have the most proper correlation and prediction of a potential attack, it's essential to roll up the audit log to a data lake that has full visibility of your entire infrastructure. And more commonly, that's going to be a SIEM, right? A SIEM provider who's ingesting security logs from your identity provider, whether it's like Okta, your endpoint protection, your data protection, and your firewalls, your routers, and your network solutions. If you have all of those resources connected to your SIEM, you can use K10's events to bring more of that solid confirmation. Whenever you see something suspicious around data, it's almost a 90% certain type of thing. In our view, it's a more certain attack. But you have to pair it with more context. If identity was breached, or if the networks are moving, there's lateral movement in the network. Those are things, unfortunately, Kasten can't see, but paired with a robust data lake and a robust machine learning system, you can use our events to enrich the full visibility solution.
All right. Thank you, Joey. Then there is a question, I think you partly addressed it before, but I just want to make sure because it's really a good question. So Atul is with a cybersecurity company, and of course they follow security very seriously. And thank you for being on this webinar. You're at the right place. So the question is how they can leverage the Kasten API to restrict to working locally only without exposing any requests to the outside while verifying policies.
Yeah, a couple approaches kind of comes to mind here. If the goal is to prevent a user, say, exfiltrating data, for example, you can the hardest stance you can take is to air gap, right? To keep everything localized so that networks can't theoretically move outside of your cluster. That would be probably the most strict, and obviously that's going to be the most burdensome in terms of manageability. But I would say you can also use, earlier we talked about the policy as code. So let me jump back to this slide. Policy as code inspects resources on your Kubernetes cluster. In Kasten, a backup job is actually a Kubernetes resource. A restore job is a Kubernetes resource. Theoretically, you could write a code sample that says, for any restore job being kicked off and it being sent to the Kubernetes API server, inspect where it's going. Is this going to a trusted namespace, a trusted cluster, a trusted object store? If you have a white list of trusted cloud targets, you can actually have the policy as code look for those trusted targets. And if it doesn't find that trusted target, it's going to kill that resource. So essentially, it's going to kill that restore job. So the policy as code is very strong for enforcement. RBAC is for giving people rights. Policy as code is actually taking away actions and behaviors you don't like, the things that you don't want. So it's a very powerful tool, and a lot of the security community has started to adopt policy as code now.
All right, thank you, Joey. Well, we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that we announce the winner of the $200 gift card. I was told that we randomly selected a Jeff Fisher. So congratulations to Jeff. And I would say to the other attendees, you have another chance to win a gift card on next month's Cube Series webinar. So keep an eye out for that newsletter. And you're welcome, Jeff. Keep an eye out for that newsletter. And see you next time. Joey, thank you so much for a great webinar. I think we all learned a lot. So have a good rest of your day, everybody.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming.